Good afternoon. The first item I have for the board is a review of our proposed 2025-2026 school year calendar, looking to the future. Again, so that those who are watching are not confused, this is not for the next school year, but 2025. So Mrs. Coy, our Chief of Staff, will provide the overview.
Wonderful, thank you. Good afternoon, Chair Atkins, Vice Chair Shea, Dr. Cashwell, and members of the board. This afternoon, I am pleased to bring you a presentation about the development of the 2025-2026 calendar for your initial review and consideration. The development of calendar recommendations is a collaborative effort that includes a wide variety of stakeholders and a great deal of input. Our HCPS calendar committee began meeting last fall to initiate conversations on this 25-26 calendar, to shape the community survey, and to develop recommendations. Additionally, this year, more than 1,200 individuals participated in our community survey on the topic. We are incredibly grateful to our teachers, principals, parents, and even students who weighed in via many different mechanisms to help inform the recommendations. So thank you to each of you for your time and consideration. As HCPS approached this calendar development cycle, there were a few topics that were at the forefront of our conversations. As always, we asked our stakeholders what they like and don't like about our current approaches. This helps us affirm some of our ongoing practices and flag some that may no longer be serving us well. Additionally, this was the second year in which we requested feedback around a staggered start. We sought feedback as well on our professional learning days, of which there are now 3 this current school year for the first time. And then finally, as we have in recent years, we sought feedback on our wellness days as they become an established part of our calendars. This year's community survey was available in English and Spanish throughout January and February. We were really pleased to see an increase in participation this year with more than 1,200 respondents. However, we also, at the same time, recognize that response only reflects a small percentage of our entire community. In addition to specific questions, we provided an opportunity for participants to provide open-ended feedback at the end of that survey. As I mentioned, we explored the staggered start. So in this survey participants were given 2 options. They were given 2 options about our wellness days. Currently, those wellness days are placed next to our professional learning days in November and in February, creating a 3-day staff weekend and a 4-day student weekend. Survey participants affirmed that approach in November when the PL day falls on election day. However, they were evenly split when asked about the February day, when provided an alternate option to spread those days out and create 2 3-day weekends for students. A detailed report on the survey results is attached in your meeting materials for your reference. The most significant topic is related to that staggered start. So a staggered start can take many different forms, but the general idea is that a school division brings back some grades on the first day of school and then phases in remaining grades on subsequent days. There are a number of reasons some divisions have adopted such an approach. This model generally aims to facilitate a really smooth transition for students entering a new building, fostering a strong sense of belonging and school connectedness, and offering a comprehensive and equitable orientation experience and start to the year for those grades starting in a new building. So this year, the calendar committee advanced the conversations related to the staggered start by meeting with Chesterfield and Hanover to learn more about their particular models, which are different. Based on the learnings shared, the calendar committee then developed its own proposal, which is what was reflected in that survey. In the HCPS proposal, half of pre-K and kindergarten students would start on Monday, August 18th, and the other half would start on Tuesday, 19th, flip-flop. The half that comes on Monday do not attend on Tuesday, and those that attend on Tuesday do not attend on Monday. All other elementary grades, 1 through 5, would start school on Monday as usual. Additionally, under the HCPS proposal from the committee, all 6th and 9th grade students would start on Monday, August 18th, and all the other secondary students, grades 7, 8, 10, 11, and 12, would start on Tuesday. So survey participants were given information about this model, and then they were asked to rate their level of support for this specific HCPS proposal. The results from this survey, this year's calendar survey, shifted slightly compared to last year's. So last year we asked general questions about a staggered start at different levels, pre-K, K, 6th and 9th grades. And the participants responded slightly differently to each level. This year, that single question was asked about support for the entire proposal. As you can see, the number of undecided individuals decreased significantly this year. Those supporting the approach increased, and those disagreeing with the approach remained consistent. Positions on the proposed staggered start varied by different survey participant types. So as you can see, overall, about 56% of the survey participants supported the proposal, 28% opposed, and 16 remained undecided. Again, this is a decrease in the number of undecideds, but those disagreeing with the approach remained just under at 30%. And teachers were the group that had the greatest concern out of all of those groups. The comments that were offered on the staggered start revealed more nuance about the support for and concerns with the proposal. The most significant were related to the needs of working parents, potential confusion with families, and concerns among inequities among staff. Additionally, many of our participants offered alternative proposals for a phased-in approach to the school year. So the culmination of the input you've heard about today is reflected in the recommended calendar included in the meeting materials. It maintains those diverse religious and cultural holidays, 2 wellness days placed next to the professional learning days, only a few half days to allow our teachers to complete clerical work at the end of each quarter while also seeking to minimize student absences, and 3 professional development days for staff, that addition to the 24-25 school year based on previous feedback. At this time, the calendar does not include a staggered start, but the recommendation is to further pursue conversations with staff and families about that approach through focus groups and community conversations. And that concludes my presentation. We're happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you, Ms. Coy, for the presentation and for your team's hard work in putting it together for us. We'll move forward with feedback, commencing to my left with Mr. Irving.
Yeah, so I don't have any questions, but I have the distinct luxury of actually doing this myself, so I can speak from experience from the past 2 years of it. And I think that it is both good for 6th and 9th graders who are, because I think that's the biggest change in terms of school for most children. In elementary school, you're with your teacher all day, and generally with a parent. Middle school, you get that first taste of freedom when you're in a new building and you're having to travel somewhat on your own without teacher input. And then in high school, you really have that independence where, you know, your teachers aren't even necessarily in the same place. So I think from a navigating a building standpoint, it makes students feel more comfortable. In my school, we go through a presentation that has different procedures of how we do things within our building. You get to see all of your classes within 1 day, so you can know where every person is. You get to meet your teacher. You can get a little heads up on what to expect. There's a standard presentation that's given in every single class by bell period, so everybody's receiving the same message once. There's team building activities that occur during those days, and there's an assembly that takes place on like expectation setting for how high school or middle school may be different from where you just came from. From a teacher standpoint, if you don't teach 6th or 9th graders, it's still a normal planning day for you. If you do teach them, you know, you would have them anyways. And so I think it's a good chance just to ease students in, make it a non-pressured day where they can just be in the building without having to worry about what's expected of them immediately. and just get their wits about them. And, you know, for most teachers, it just ends up being another teacher workday like it had been. So I enjoy that we're proposing this, and just as someone who has done it, I think that it has a lot of benefits.
Thank you, Mr. Irving. Mr. Young.
Yeah, a couple questions. Love it for middle and high school. Just questioning the elementary school. Maybe you can speak to what does the staggered start particularly do for pre-K and K? Is it just like a couple classes starting one day and then a couple the following Tuesday?
Yep,
Right.
happy to share more about that. So in the HCPS proposal, which was different than what they heard happens in Chesterfield and Hanover, they were trying to take lessons from each. The proposal is that those students would be split in half in classrooms. Half would come Monday, half would come Tuesday, and the other half would not attend on the flip day. The benefit to that being that teachers have even fewer children to start establishing those routines, those relationships, and welcoming those students to a new building. In Chesterfield, my understanding is that it happens over the course of a whole week. And the HCPS model was just to break it up over those 2 days. One of the realities that was shared with our group was families don't always get that right, understandably so. And so those doors are open to students no matter what day they're supposed to be there or when they show up, they're welcomed into those classrooms regardless.
Thank you. No more questions.
Thank you, Mr. Young. Mrs. Shea.
Thank you. Ms. Coy, just a question about the staggered start, as I know it's not being recommended for this calendar, but obviously part of the conversation. How does that staggered start count for seat time?
That is a great question. So students, well, for the secondary level, it would not impact attendance, for example, for a 7th grader not to be there one of those days, that first day, I should say. When we're looking at the 140 clock hours for those, yep, that's what you're getting at, okay. We would, that first day of school, those hours would not be part of that entire experience. The upperclassmen would not be held accountable for not being there that day. When we talk to the other divisions about attendance and the back-end support for that, their systems are set up to account for that accordingly, so that the 9th graders are accounted for attendance-wise, but nobody else is penalized.
Great. So having a staggered start would not necessarily add an extra, have to add an extra day in time. Okay. Okay. Moving to the specific calendar now instead of the broad ideas, can you share the thoughts with me on the half day on Wednesday 1/14 instead of Friday 1/16? Just kind of flesh out those.
Happy to. So as we had conversations with this board in recent years, we looked at data around attendance on half days on Fridays versus other days of the week and tried to balance those out, recognizing that the attendance numbers rise on those Fridays that are half days. And so the committee sought to provide balance there. We do have some at the end of the week, but not all of them to account for that consideration.
I appreciate that and understand the need for balance, especially with the state pressure for attendance. From a family standpoint, having it on a Friday is certainly easier, especially because it happens to be next to a 3-day weekend. So no directive there, just throwing that out for consideration as the team continues to peel back those layers. I also don't know the last time we had a half day that wasn't tagged to a weekend. I think it's been a handful of years. Could be very wrong in terms of pulling our attendance data.
Yeah, I'll have to double check. Thank you.
Yeah. And then, am I correct? It seems that spring break here has moved a smidge backwards, which we heard a lot of feedback, because it's traditionally the first full week in April, correct? And so this is a little bit, but we've heard a lot of feedback asking for that with the earlier start. So if that's the case, thank you for being responsive.
Yes, and we try and calibrate that spring break with our regional counterparts and have had conversations with them about how it falls in that particular year, that it splits the week. But with the early end to the years, it's consistent with how it falls after the end of the third quarter. All to say, we are the first in the region to consider a 25-26 calendar in that regard, but have had those conversations with the region to ensure we're all lining up properly there.
I think it's great, especially when we look at end of the year testing, which is, there's some that we have a window on, and there's some that are fixed right there at the beginning of May. And so giving, more breathing room there, and with the earlier start and earlier end, I like that swinging to the week that includes April 1st as opposed to the first full week of April. So that's all for me. Thank you for all the time and stakeholder feedback. The calendar is very important to the community, and so I appreciate the time and effort there.
Thank you, Mrs. Shea. Mrs. Kinsella.
Thank you. As it comes with almost every survey that we do, the response rate is so low, especially of a division of our size. Do we know what to attribute that to?
No, other than I will say it was nearly double what the response rate was last year when we asked about calendars. And so we saw a significant increase this year. We shifted the timing of our survey this year in part because of how the school year is ending and backing up considerations for you all on your calendars. And so it fell at a different time of year. Part of that overlapped with our HCPS survey. There are a lot of surveys we have out there. And so I think it's fair to say sometimes that feeds into fatigue generally when it comes to these topics.
Thank you for that. I do support, I like the idea that we're exploring the staggered start, and I'm glad we're not implementing it in the fall. I do think we need greater conversation around it, because what looks good for another division may not be what works for Henrico and our families and our employees. I would like to thank Dr. Cashwell and the team for being so responsive when I requested from employee feedback if the in-person work days and the virtual, the in-person professional learning days could be noted on the calendar. I'm appreciative of that, so that our employees know if they need to have childcare on those days. So thank you for that, as well as the inclusion of Summer Academy 25-26. Not only do our employees need that information to plan, but also our families do too. So thank you for those inclusions. I have a question. Did our group consider kindergarten and first grade? The first grade adjustment is a big one too, going from kindergarten to first grade. Was that considered at all? I mean, transportation looks so different in first grade from kindergarten. It's just a question if that was considered.
Yeah. I don't know that it was a focal point of the conversation around staggered start. They were primarily looking at pre-K and K, but that would be something for us to continue looking at.
And then is anything, I know the VHSL has their separate calendar. And I know that oftentimes our student athletes have inquired, do we take into account the VHSL calendar when we're doing our school calendars? So I just thought I would ask.
As far as lining our calendar up to VHSL?
Or just looking at some of the
Those dates that line up. Yep, we will double check those. But yes, generally we do try and look at them both.
I'm sorry, okay. Let's see, is there any, did you hear any feedback about all the days out in October? I heard from some teachers specifically about that. Do we have any thoughts on that?
Yes, in our survey and just through the course of the calendar committee, we try and compile feedback we get from constituents, whether it's regarding kind of current year calendars or the calendar at hand. The way in which some of the religious holidays and wellness days and election days fall, we did get some feedback on that. And then kind of on the flip side of that, as we look ahead where dates fall differently, got feedback on how those days fall in the future.
Okay. Thank you, and I do appreciate the consistency, and I know that feedback appreciated that as well. Thank you very much. Ms. Atkins?
Thank you, Mrs. Kinsella. Mrs. Shea.
Yeah, just a brief redirect. When you brought up VHSL, it reminded me, I got quite a bit of feedback this year, particularly around VHSL near winter break, because we went so much longer into December than we typically do, that some of the teams ended up with, between sickness and travel and all of those things, like 6 people on the basketball team for a basketball game and things like that. And so not necessarily something to move the school calendar to, but since Ms. Kinsella brought it forward, as we think about kind of global activity calendar, planning for our students, just some feedback that came to mind. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, colleagues. I only had one thought, which was around resources around the staggered times. Is there a significant increase in resources in trying to accomplish the staggered start times?
Generally speaking, not in the models that we looked at. So when we were examining this and talking to our counter colleagues in other divisions, looked at things like, do all of your buses still run? Are the cafeterias up and running? Yes, generally it's the same amount of resources, but in some cases with smaller subsets of students, teachers are still working that day, staff are still in buildings as they would be. I don't think, and I'm thinking through our conversations together, that there were any additional resources that were necessary that we discussed as a committee.
Thank you for your response, and thank you and your team for the overall presentation. Dr. Cashwell.
Thank you, and we'll look forward to continuing that conversation as we move towards approval of the school year 25-26 calendar at a future meeting.